Welcome, Pewter Report readers, viewers, and listeners to a brand new edition of the Pewter Report podcast, Energized by Celsius, the official energy drink of PewterReport.com. It is a Thursday edition of the show, our last episode of the week, but we are saving the best for last as we have a very special guest joining us today that we'll get to momentarily. I want to say hello to all the Pewter people joining the chat as we talk today about can Baker Mayfield do it again? He had a career resurgence last season, signed a big deal with the Bucs, got that mega contract, and now it's an encore season for Baker and the Bucs. We'll also get into the Randy Gregory signing that happened yesterday and his press conference that happened this afternoon as well. So a lot to get into on this fun show. I'm your host, Matt Matera. Joined with me is the face that runs the place at PewterReport.com, Scott Reynolds. And joining us today, we are very lucky to have a very special guest. He is the senior producer of NFL Films and the founder and host of the great show NFL Matchup. Ladies and gentlemen, the legendary Greg Cosell joining us today. Greg, thank you so much for joining the show. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Excellent. We always love having you on the show. You're an absolute guru when it comes to watching film. I don't think anybody watches more film than you. I mean, you work for NFL Film, so it's a perfect fit for your area of expertise.
Well, let's hope so, because I've been so focused on watching college tape. I'm trying to remember, the season, the NFL season, which seemed to me like it happened about 5 years ago.
Right. It all moves so quickly. Like you're watching the season, and then it's free agency, and then it's the draft, and it's just going and going and going.
Yeah, I jumped right into the college players pretty much toward the end of the NFL season, because there's obviously fewer games, so I can get through the games, and then later in the week, because my matchup show's all set.
Yeah.
I started watching college guys, probably mid-January.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all I've been doing ever since.
Well, that's perfect. We do want to start today, and we'll get into some college stuff as well, because that is kind of the topic this month. It is draft month. But I'm fascinated to know your thoughts about Baker Mayfield, right? He's had a kind of a meteoric, mercurial career, right? Started off as the number 1 overall draft pick in 2018. Had some ups and downs with the Browns. Obviously, a very challenging year for him professionally and personally in 2022. In one calendar year, right? Going from the Browns to the Panthers to the Rams to the Buccaneers. And then having that, as Matt said, a career resurgence season in Tampa Bay last year. And ended up making a Pro Bowl, due to the fact that
Whatever
Dak
that
Prescott.
means.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
Due to the fact that Dak Prescott opted out. But
hey, made the most of it.
Yeah,
won the Pro Bowl MVP.
Yeah, he goes there, and
I hate to say, guys, I didn't watch the Pro Bowl. Sorry,
no, I haven't watched it in years. So I'm with you on that. But he goes there, he wins a skill competition, he gets the MVP for whatever that's worth in flag football these days. But I'm just curious, how would you classify Baker Mayfield's season last year? Was it good? Was it very good? Was it great? And more importantly, do you think he can do it again?
Well, let me answer it this way. Obviously, when you reached out to me, you would mention you wanted to discuss this. So I've given it a moment or two of thought. I don't think there's a lot of mystery to Baker Mayfield in the way in which he has to play to be successful. And I think everybody knows that. I mean, I talked to coaches over the years, not specifically about him, but coaches who've been on the offensive coaches who've been on the staff with Baker as the quarterback. So I've had conversations, and I don't think there's a lot of mystery. I think Baker, at his core, and I actually thought this when I watched his tape coming out of Oklahoma, he's essentially a timing rhythm player. And he's smaller, so he needs to be protected. I remember the one year in Cleveland when it kind of went downhill, they were stuck in 3rd and long so many times. And, obviously no quarterback wants to be in that situation. Some can handle it better than others. Yeah. That's not his deal. While he's not a statue or totally immobile, he's not really a playmaker in that sense. So he's a timing rhythm player. And I think Dave Canales understood that really well. And now they have Liam Coen. And given his background, I would expect that Baker Mayfield would really like this offense and would really like, all the concepts, because as you guys have probably talked about, I don't remember when Liam Coen was exactly hired, but I'm sure you've had this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the Ram stuff. So it's a lot of motion. It's a lot of reduced cut splits. It's a lot of stacks. It's a lot of bunches. It gets guys free access off the ball.
Yeah.
It defines the routes and the throws for the quarterback pretty cleanly. That's what Baker Mayfield needs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every quarterback ideally would want that.
Right.
As I said, some need that more than others.
Yeah.
And Baker does. And there's no reason to believe that he can't play well within the system. Now, he still needs to be protected. You know, he's a smaller guy. He's not necessarily great when there's bodies around him.
Yeah.
And again, people listening could say, well, every quarterback wants to be protected. Yes, of course. But again, same point. Some need it more than others in order to succeed. So, you know, I think that this offense, quite frankly, is a really good fit for almost any quarterback, and certainly for a Baker Mayfield kind of quarterback. So, you know, again, I'm not one, and I'm sure you guys aren't either. We're not going to sit here and say what his numbers or statistics will be, or how many games the Bucs will win. There's so many. You guys know there's 100 variables right now as we speak in early April. But you know, I would expect that he'd be really comfortable in this offense. He would like it. Mm-hmm. It presents things and defines things really well for the quarterback. And I don't know if people think about Baker Mayfield this way, but he throws the ball really well. Yeah. I mean, there's never been an issue with how Baker Mayfield throws the football.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He's got a cannon for an arm. I mean, he can sling it, right? And let me ask you this, Greg. When you watch the tape on Baker Mayfield, and him being vertically challenged at 6'1" and not really seeing unless he has that clean pocket with those set passing windows, right? Is it any wonder that his favorite receiver on the team happened to be the 6'5" guy? Granted, Mike Evans is really, really good, but does that help with those 35-inch arms, the catch radius, and all of that?
I mean, I think it always
a smaller
helps.
Quarterback like that.
I think it always helps a quarterback when they feel that they have a receiver, and he's actually got two in Godwin as well, who's a big guy, where you feel comfortable throwing to one-on-ones. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's another factor. Now, you're always going to get man coverage at times in the league, but the nature of this offense too, and the pass game with Liam Coen is such that it's not going to just be, hey, line him up on the outside. It'll be a little different for Mike Evans. I mean, he was clearly their boundary X, and he would split out to the short side of the field a good part of the time. And you could always feel that you had a mismatch. Now, obviously, it's the NFL. Corners are good, so it doesn't work all the time. But you would always feel good making that throw. Now, I'm not saying that they'll never do that. Of course they will. He's close to 6'5", and he's a great player. So, of course, they'll do that, particularly depending on the opponent when they feel that they have a matchup that they feel good about. But there's going to be a lot more in terms of him lining up in different places, in terms of stack bunches, more reduced splits. There's going to be a lot more that define it more clearly. And I would think Mike Evans would like that as well. So, sure. You know, it's a very, and I hate to be cliched. It's, you know, it's one of those terms that I hate, but I think it's a quarterback friendly and receiver friendly offense in the way it presents and defines things for the quarterback.
I'm curious to get your thoughts. You know, last year was such career resurgence for Baker Mayfield, like I mentioned earlier. I'm just wondering if you saw anything, and maybe it is just because he was playing with Mike Evans or had a quarterback-friendly offense with Dave Canales. But what was the biggest difference for Baker last season for why he had so much success compared to what didn't work towards the tail end of Cleveland and his travels to Carolina?
But that's a hard question to answer, you know, and I can't remember all the specifics of, you know, what happened prior. Don't forget, it looked like he was going to be a really good player in Cleveland. And then things went downhill. As I said, that year where he really struggled, I remember talking, and I don't know if you know Nathan Zagura, who does the games for Browns radio. And he had a year where it seemed like they were in third and long on every third down. And that's just really hard. And again, because he's essentially a pocket player and the defense often has the tactical advantage more often than not on third and long, and he's not a runaround playmaking dimension quarterback, it's going to be hard to really have any kind of consistent execution on third and long when your game is really built on being a drop back quarterback. So it made it a really difficult season for him. And then what happened after that, moving around so much, that's hard on anybody. So I know it's not a great answer to your question,
no, that's fine.
But you know, he's a number one pick in a draft, and he throws the ball really well. It's funny. I remember watching him at Oklahoma, and obviously Saturdays, I work 7 days a week during the NFL season, but on Saturdays I'll usually get home, by 3:00 and put on college football. And I'm not sitting there studying the games, okay? But I'm watching, they're on. And there's so many games, so if you want, you could flip around to it seems like 15 games are on at the same time.
It's a buffet.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember, I don't know why I had this impression of Baker Mayfield as being kind of a mobile guy. And then I remember watching his tape, after the season, and that's not the way he played at all. He was actually a very efficient pocket player. Yeah. And that's what he is. And I don't know if people still have this sense of him as being a guy that's going to make plays, but he's really not that guy. He needs the scheme to work. He needs to be protected, ideally in the middle, because the center and the two guards, they control the depth of the pocket, and he needs the depth controlled. The tackles control the width of the pocket. He needs the depth of the pocket controlled because he is, just over 6 feet. Right. So, you've got to make sure that you can take care of that. So he does have clean sight lines. And the other thing is he's a step thrower. Some guys don't need to step into it. He's a step thrower. So he absolutely needs the depth of the pocket handled because he needs to step into his throws. That's just the way he throws the ball. That's not going to change now.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up this. You're leading me right into my next question because things would be different in Tampa Bay, not just for Tom Brady in his last season, but maybe Baker Mayfield if he had Ryan Jensen at center and if he had Ali Marpet at left guard. Right? And he doesn't, right? Marpet was a sudden retirement at age 30, still in his prime off of a Pro Bowl season and after the 2021 season. And then Ryan Jensen gets hurt that year, right? Tom Brady comes back and he's like, wait a minute, I don't have Marpet or Jensen. And we saw the struggles that even the greatest quarterback of all time had. And Robert Hainsey's been a serviceable center. There's a hole at left guard that's going to have to be filled probably in the draft. So what you're saying is if you protect him better, especially in the middle, and we'll see how the second year of Cody Mauch progresses, you're going to get a better Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, and I'm not telling Jason Light what he should or shouldn't do. Yeah. But I think that when you have Baker Mayfield, who you obviously just laid out a ton of cash for, you have to make sure that the center and guard position are taken care of. Now, you don't need 3 all-pros, but you still need. That can't be a weakness on your team because then your quarterback can't function. And you just gave him a lot of money with the expectation that you're going to, get into the playoffs and have a good season. And obviously there's other holes to fill. There always are with teams, but, that's just the way it is in the salary cap era. You just spent a lot of money on Baker Mayfield, who is a very good thrower of the football, but he's a certain kind of quarterback. He can be successful as that kind of quarterback, as we know, but it's very hard for him to be successful if the depth of the pocket is not controlled and taken care of.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just wonder, too, if Jason doesn't kind of realize it, and you see teams make these pre-draft signings of free agency, right? Just to kind of say, okay, well, we're going to eliminate a need off the draft board. And I'm not saying that the Buccaneers are not going to sign an outside linebacker now, but with the signing of Randy Gregory yesterday, and it was announced today, they don't have to go offensive line, or I should say outside linebacker early. It maybe lessens a little bit of that pre-draft burden where, he can look at the first or second round and say, we can go center or we can go offensive guard here. We've had Jackson Powers Johnson in our mock drafts earlier this offseason. We have Duke's Graham Barton, in there right now. I think either one of those players would be plug and play players at either center or guard for the Buccaneers and help out with what you're saying.
Yeah, and as you guys know, when it gets to the draft, and by the way, just before I say that, it's April 4th. No team is finished doing what they're doing. I mean, we haven't had the draft yet. And, obviously fans always want a sexy free agent signing. It doesn't have to work out that way. It's nice when there is. And by the way, there's no guarantee that those work either. So there's a lot that's going to happen between now and training camp, whatever day that opens, late July. So a lot's going to happen. I think the people who've been in the business for a long time. I'm talking about team executives, and Jason Light certainly has. Todd Bowles been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
They're not in panic mode on April 4th. That's
right.
fans might be, but that's why they're fans, and that's the fun of it. Is that's why we all have jobs. But at the end of the day, it's April 4th. So there's a long way to go here with what they're going to do. And look, what I said about the O-line, they know this. That I didn't say anything that's major news.
Right.
It's a reality of life when you have a quarterback like Baker, but it's not like I just gave you a scoop.
Yes, exactly. Well said.
What do you make of the skill position players for the Buccaneers? Maybe outside of Mike Evans, because we know what he brings to the table, and Chris Godwin's obviously been very important to this team. But now with this new offense with Liam Coen, will be similar things from last year's offense, but it seems like there will be a little bit more of an importance of having a third wide receiver that wasn't totally figured out for the Bucs last season. What do you think of players such as Trey Palmer or the tight end Cade Otton, and if they really need to add another piece to that skill position room?
Well, I think you always want to add a piece, but Palmer can run. I remember doing him coming out of Nebraska. I mean, obviously, he's got great vertical ability. You always like to have a vertical dimension in your offense because it helps regulate the defense and how they have to play. Even if he's not a volume target, and he probably wouldn't be within the context of this offense, but still, it helps regulate the defense and gives you some big plays. I like Cade Otton. I mean, is he one of those tight ends? Those dynamic tight ends? You probably wouldn't say that he is, but I think he's a real solid player. We saw last year that he can run the seam, so, I think Otton's a nice player. Obviously the Rams for years, who Liam Coen is obviously familiar with, is Higbee. Higbee might be a little more dynamic, but Higbee's not Travis Kelce. So, I think that Otton can certainly fit what they want to get done. And he does have a formation versatility. He can line up anywhere in the formation. And then I really like Rachaad White a lot. I mean, I remember when he came out of ASU, and I'm not going to sit here and say he's Todd Gurley in his prime, but we're talking about deployment of a player, and I get caught with this all the time on social media, and I'm not one who actually sits and responds to people, but I try to explain that what I'm talking about is deployment and style, not the exact analogy between players. Obviously for 3 years, Todd Gurley may have been the best back in the league. So I'm not going to sit here and say Rachaad White's the best back in the league, but Rachaad White is a good runner, a really good receiver that I think is still a little bit untapped. And I'll be very anxious to see how he's deployed in the context of the Liam Coen offense. But I really like Rachaad White. I really liked him coming out of ASU.
Yeah, he was a huge factor in the passing game. But I do agree with you. I feel like they could still do a little bit more with him in that passing game. As you mentioned, untapped. He had a great touchdown on as a receiver against the Green Bay Packers. You just had that picture up, Scott, when the Bucs played the Packers. And that was just one example.
That might have been, I'm trying to remember the play. That might have been H-seam, if memory serves me correctly. I think it was H-seam,
Right.
And he can run those routes. See, he can run real routes. He's not just a check down or a flat route. I mean, I remember watching him at ASU. He split out. I mean, you can detach him from the formation. You can do a lot of things with Rachaad White in the pass game.
It's funny you mentioned Arizona State, right? It's like that was a team that at one point had Jaden Daniels at quarterback,
Brandon Ayuk was his receiver.
And then you've got Ricky Pearsall and Johnny Wilson were also on that ASU team.
That's right.
It's like
that's a great point. Yeah.
But then they go to other teams and they do good things. But
no, I mean, but Matt, to speak to your point, I think the skill positions are pretty good here. I mean, does that mean they're not going to draft a receiver? I would say that the only way they would draft a receiver, in my view, high is if they got to their pick and a guy they had, let's say, when do they pick in the first round?
26.
Yeah. So let's say he gets to 26, and for whatever reason, there's a receiver there that they had rated 9th in the entire draft. Then maybe you draft him. But for the most part, I don't think they're going into the first round saying we need a receiver. I think they'll draft one within the draft, but I don't think that would be viewed as, hey, we better get a receiver or else.
Yeah. At the same time, though, when you look at what Liam Coen's bringing from the Rams, and it's different from what Dave Cannell's brought to Seattle. There's some carryover right, in terms of Shane Waldron going from the Rams to
Yeah, so there is
Seattle.
carryover.
Right. But when you look at the deployment of, say, 12 personnel, those double tight end sets, Dave Canales used those, I think, over 20 to 25% here in Tampa. And you look at the Rams, now granted, Liam Neeson was in Kentucky last year, not in LA, but in that Sean McVay Rams offense, looking at 95%, 11 personnel. And so when you look at Tampa Bay's lineup, it's going to be more wide receiver driven, and it's going to be less like double tight end driven. So really that third wide receiver, whether it's Palmer or whether it's a draft pick or whoever, is going to be a starter, right?
Well, but keep in mind too, and I agree, you're 100% right, Scott. But the other point too is in that offense. I mean, look at Puka Nacua, okay?
Right.
Yeah.
Look, Puka Nacua obviously had a great year numbers wise, but no one is going to say that he's a top 5 receiver in the league.
Yeah.
He had great numbers. So it's an offense. There are some offenses that are really well schemed, put together. Look at Detroit, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I
Just
mean, Amon-Ra St.
base,
Brown
right?
is a nice player.
Yeah.
No one's going to argue that he's not a nice player.
Yeah.
But he's not Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase or one of those guys. He's just not. And he was a 4th round pick, by the way. And Nacua was what, a 5th round pick or a 6th round pick? This offense, because of the way it's schemed and composed and put together, really helps receivers. I mean, taking nothing away from Cooper Kupp, who, when healthy, is obviously phenomenal.
Yeah.
He came out of Eastern Washington. I remember being at the combine and he ran a 4.62, and everybody is, oh man, now the guy's a 5th round pick. And I guess he ended up being a 3rd rounder. If I'm trying to remember all this.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously won the Triple Crown one year, and he's great because he knows how to run routes.
Yeah.
But this offense really sets up receivers to perform, or let's put it this way, sets up receivers to get a lot of volume and be really productive.
So what's the biggest fundamental thing that the average Buccaneer fan in the stands is going to see or watching at home on television from the Dave Canales offense to the Liam Coen offense? Is it going to be the 3-by-1 splits, the 11 personnel usage?
The 11 personnel, number one, will be a high percentage, as you said. And then here are the things that, if you're a fan, you can look for. Number one, there'll be a lot of motion and shifts. There'll be shifts and motions. Number two, you're going to see a lot of what we call cut splits by the receivers tighter to the formation. You're going to see a lot of stacks. Stacks are usually 2 receivers. You'll see a lot of bunches, which is 3 receivers. And often these are close to the formation.
Yeah.
It's very hard to press that, and receivers get free access into their routes, which does not disrupt the timing of the pass game, which, by the way, also plays to Baker. So those are things that fans can expect to see from a Liam Coen offense. Now, as I said, that doesn't mean it happens 100% of the time. Of course it doesn't. Nothing does in the NFL.
Yeah.
But those are sort of foundational staples.
And the interesting thing too is when it's a 3-by-1, which means 3 weapons, right? It could be a tight end, it could be 2 receivers, 3 receivers, whatever, on one side, and then that
one receiver to the boundary.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be a tight end. It can
without
be
question.
Mike Evans. It can be a running back.
It doesn't have to be, a Travis Kelce tight end.
Right.
It can be Kate Otten. That's because don't forget that we call that a 1-by-3 when it's a tight end as opposed to 3-by-1. So when it's 1-by-3, one of the things that does is that really gives the quarterback a lot of pre-snap information because the defense has to respond if it's 1-by-3, particularly if you put speed to number 3 to trips. So if you line up with Kate Otten as your single receiver to the boundary and put Trey Palmer at number 3 to trips, this all started with Tyreek Hill when Andy Reid would split out Kelce as the number 1 tight end, and then he'd put Tyreek Hill at number 3 to trips. And the way teams normally played it is they'd have an underneath defender in zone run with number 3. But you can't have a linebacker run with Tyreek Hill. So now what happens is if you put speed at number 3 to trips, you can't have a linebacker run with Trey Palmer either. It's not, and we're not saying he's as good as Tyreek Hill, but Trey Palmer's a 4.35 guy or whatever he is. He can run, as you guys know. So it helps the quarterback pre-snap because you're trying to give him as much information before the snap of the ball as you possibly can.
One of the things too that's interesting is Chris Godwin thrived for so many years in Bruce Arians' offense as that slot receiver, right? That Larry Fitzgerald type role, and would often lead the team in targets and catches and was just a more productive player there. And then Dave Canales comes and he gets split out to the flanker position a little bit more, playing that Z receiver outside, and kind of got lost in the shuffle a little bit. The touchdown production has gone down for him, and some of those targets, gone down. Even his wife took to social media, kind of like, "Hey, what about my husband here? Like, don't forget about him." But it's interesting because Godwin now, according to what Liam Neeson said, is going to be going back into the slot more often, and
I would expect Godwin to kind of fill in this offense kind of the Cooper Kupp role.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what he was saying. This is a big year for Godwin because he's 28 years old now. He'll be 29 by the start of next football season when he's a free agent. He's also in the last year of his contract, making $20 million. So you expect to see more of a resurgence in terms of the numbers and the production because of this for Chris Godwin.
Yeah, I do. I mean, assuming health, I think he'd fill the Cooper Kupp role in the context of this offense. And so he's going to get targets, and I assume he'll get receptions.
Yeah. Tell me too, Greg, how is this going to benefit the Bucs running game? Because Tampa Bay has had the worst running game in the league the last couple of years. And even though they improved by 10 yards per game last year, they still were like the bottom because the league got better. The pendulum has swung back to let's run the ball now a little bit more. And so, but I would imagine with more 3-by-1 or 1-by-3 sets that the Buccaneers by formation and personnel usage are going to be dictating that the defense run lighter boxes as a result, and maybe more nickel and dime defense, right?
But what will happen, Scott, is there will be an emphasis placed on wide receivers blocking, because that was a big deal with the Rams, and it is a big deal with the Rams. Kupp's a great blocker, Nakua is a great. I mean, it's part of what they do, and I think that's going to be really emphasized. I'm sure it's been spoken about already. I know they're not allowed to, be on the practice field yet, but I'm sure it's been spoken about with Liam Coen talking, and even Todd Bowles, I'm sure, having these conversations with Mike Evans, with Godwin, with Palmer. Palmer's not a little guy.
Right. It's very true.
So, I mean, I'm sure it's been made clear that, in this offense, you're going to catch a lot of balls and you're going to get a lot of targets, because just think about Cooper Kupp and Nakua, but you know what? You're going to have to block. Because when you line up in more cut splits, reduced splits, the defense, particularly safeties and corners, they can play a little closer. So receivers have to block. And that'll be a major factor.
Yeah, and, talking to Chris Godwin, he is a wide receiver that does enjoy blocking. He said he almost likes it. He's very physical. He likes it just as much as being a wide receiver. And I'm curious, with all of the motion that's going to be coming in this offense, how can that motion help the run game in terms of not like end arounds and things like that, but kind of throwing out some bells and whistles that makes the defense kind of look at something else, but you can still run your similar type of running play just with a little bit of a more exotic
let's understand
design.
One thing: motion is never about bells and whistles. Motion is always, there's a reason for it. And you look at the teams like the Rams, like the 49ers. A lot of times teams motion in the run game just as much or more than they do in the pass game, because it impacts run support. It impacts how you want to see how the defense is going to react to it. So that's first and foremost. The other thing motion does is it shrinks the defensive menu, because they can't really communicate as much. So that based on whatever team you're playing, whatever the opponent is, based on film study, when you do certain motions, here's how they're going to react. And that now tells you something, because they're going, like I said, they can't do a ton of communication. So they're going to play one or two defenses based on what you studied. So it helps you there as well. So motion is a big factor in the run game as well as in the pass game.
Yeah. When you look at some of the receivers, and I think I asked Liam Coen at one of his press events with the media, and I said, what do you look for in a good wide receiver? Like, what makes a wide receiver? And he said, catch radius. All right?
Who are you talking about when you say you went?
Liam Coen.
Oh, Liam Coen. Okay.
The Bucs' new offensive coordinator. And he said catch radius, right? And because sometimes if a quarterback is pressured or whatever, it's like he's going to put it near the receiver, but the guys that can go get it. You look at some of those guys that the Rams have had, the Robert Woods, the Cooper Kupps, they have enough size that they can go snatch the ball. And then you couple that with blocking, and I totally agree. The Cooper Kupps and Robert Woods, those kind of guys got after it in the run blocking game. And a couple of guys that come to mind that might be Tampa Bay fits. And I want to get your opinion on these guys since you've watched some college.
You're talking about the draft guys now?
Yeah.
Okay.
A couple of the players that the Buccaneers have had in for top 30 visits and visited with at the combine. One of which is kind of like in state in terms of wide receivers, and that's Keon Coleman from FSU. Not the fastest guy in the 40-yard dash, but he's a contested catch guy. And just your thoughts on Keon Coleman.
Yeah, and by the way, I've talked to a lot of coaches. There's a lot of coaches who believe that the blocking is something you can teach. In other words, you don't draft a receiver high, certainly. And again, when I say high, I don't just mean first round. Yeah. But you don't draft a receiver because of the way he blocks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nice. And obviously this offense requires receivers to block, but that's not why you're drafting a receiver.
Right.
I had a great conversation with a former receivers coach who said, hey, that's on me. That's on us.
Yeah.
To teach him. We're not drafting a receiver because of the way he blocks.
Right.
So, but anyway, getting back to Coleman. Coleman is going to be a polarizing guy in this draft because Coleman is there's something there in his body. There's no question there's a looseness within his body that's there to be developed. He's got really good size. He's 6'3", 213. Obviously he didn't run well in the 40, but he had the fastest gauntlet time, whatever that means.
Right.
I think people got overexcited by the contested catches because he didn't have as many as people might think. I watched all of his targets.
Yeah.
And he had one in particular against Syracuse that was ridiculous, and that's the one people remember.
Yeah.
But he does have really good hands. He certainly can make catches away from his frame. He certainly can make contested catches both on the sideline and in the middle of the field. But having said all that, I didn't necessarily love him. But that doesn't mean he won't be a good player. Like I said, there's something within him, within his body, and if you can get it out of him, that's good. I mean, I thought watching him that he was more of a straight line than change of a direction guy. Like he would have to run sort of those straight line kind of routes, verticals, overs, crossers. He's not necessarily a separator.
Right. Yeah. And how would he fit in a Liam Coen type offense? Would he have to almost be that split end and do those things?
Look, I'm not Liam Coen. I don't want to speak for him, and he could tell me I'm totally wrong. He could tell me that. I don't see him as that kind of receiver, but maybe he sees him in a way that I don't, and he certainly knows his offense better than I do. So I could be dead wrong, but I would not see him as that kind of receiver.
Since we're talking about polarizing wide receivers in terms of NFL personnel, usage and evaluation and all that, another guy that I'm quite fond of, I think Matt, I want to speak for you, but I think you are too, after seeing him at the Senior Bowl, is Malachi Corley, who was a screen heavy wide receiver at Western Kentucky, but is kind of like that yak guy that Deebo Samuel, and if you go back in the day, like you and I do, Greg, like Anquan Bolden was kind of that guy, just looks like a running back in terms of his build and the way he can break tackles. What are your thoughts on Malachi Corley?
Yeah, I don't think he's Anquan Bolden, though. I would say that, and normally this is not a concern for me, but here was a guy that didn't do much in college as far as routes at all. So he's going to have to be taught that. Now, that you can be taught that. So I'm not suggesting you can't. He certainly plays with a physical nature to his game. He's not afraid to initiate contact, run after catch. That's kind of a foundational component of how he plays the game. How do you see him within your offense? I mean, he could fit this kind of offense because he lined up, a good amount in the slot predominantly at Western Kentucky. 89 of his 115 targets came from the slot at Western Kentucky in 2023. So he's used to lining up close to the formation. So that's something that, he can do. I think he can be a movement receiver, meaning he can be your motion receiver, which is going to be a part of this offense. So He's not going to make tough contested catches. That's not his game.
Right.
So, but he can be a slot and a Z who brings a physical competitive dimension and can be a motion guy. So, maybe he does fit.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's Anquan Bolden.
Right.
It's fair. I know you said you're still watching a lot of the college players and everything like that, but
I've seen a lot of receivers though.
Okay, perfect. Because what I want to ask you is, after watching the tape of a lot of these receivers, is there anyone in particular that you're pretty big on at the moment that's maybe not necessarily, going to be a top 10 pick or anything like that?
Well, yeah, if you're asking me who's not going to be a top 10 pick, I really like Ladd McConkey from Georgia. I think he'd be great in this offense. That guy knows how to run routes. See, talking about route running, people never define it. Route running is kind of an art. Now, you have to define what that means, because obviously you run routes differently if you're being pressed. You run routes differently if it's zone coverage and there are voids. But let's assume now we're talking about working against an off coverage corner. That's where you really have to run routes. And McConkey really knows how to use his vertical stem. So what I mean by that is he understands how different routes have different pace and tempo. You don't run at the same speed.
Right.
He understands how you use your head and your body. You want to get the corner off his spot or get his body turned one way or the other. Whatever your route is, if you're breaking inside, you would love to get the corner turned to the outside, because then he can't switch and cover an in-breaking route. McConkey is a master at doing all those things.
Yeah.
And, to me, McConkey would fit this offense to a T.
Well,
he also has a connection to the Buccaneers because their wide receivers coach is Brian McClendon, who is just with Georgia.
Well, my guess is he probably likes McConkey too.
Yeah, this really made him look good for sure while at Georgia. Let's stick with the offense real quick before we get you out of here. We really appreciate your time.
Yes, we do.
Let's talk about some of the quarterbacks, because this could be a bit of a wild card situation. I know Baker Mayfield was just signed for 3 years, right? $100 million. He's not going anywhere. And the Buccaneers have been so fortunate, Greg, because you look at the last 4 years, the reason why they won the Super Bowl and then 3 straight division championships, Tom Brady didn't miss a start. Baker Mayfield last year didn't miss a start.
Right.
And so having that is a type of health at the quarterback position. It's rare in this day and age when you're talking about 300-pound defenders coming after him left and right. But at the same time, nothing's assured, right? I mean, just because Baker Mayfield started all 17 games last year doesn't mean that's the case this year. Kyle Trask is the backup. The jury's still out on him because I haven't gotten a chance to see him because of the health of Brady and the health of Mayfield. He's been relegated to practice in a couple preseason games. So do you have any thoughts on Kyle Trask, the quarterback that no one's really seen?
Well, I did do him coming out of Florida, and I don't think there's a lot of mystery to him either.
Yeah.
I think that he's a pure pocket quarterback. He doesn't have very good movement. His arm is probably above average, but nothing more. I viewed him coming out of Florida as a backup. I think that's what he is. Now, he fits theoretically what they're going to do, because they're going to be, for the most part, a pocket passing team.
Yeah.
And, he fits that. But, I think that there's a reason that he's a backup, and I think he'll most likely stay as a backup in the league. But that doesn't mean if he had to play, he couldn't function at a reasonably high level, because I think the nature of this offense allows a quarterback to play at a higher level.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is he's in a contract year, right? He's they drafted him, and he has been a backup because he hasn't had to play.
He was a second-round pick, though, was he not?
Yes, he was.
Yeah,
and I thought that was a little rich, but again, that's just my opinion based on having studied him at Florida, where he obviously put up huge numbers. They had that great year. And I remember he was throwing to some really good receivers too. I can't remember who they were at the time.
Yeah.
Maybe you guys remember being in Florida, but they had a really good offense. And, but yeah, I mean, I didn't view him as a second-round pick in a draft, but he was.
The Bucs won the Super Bowl, so it was the last pick of the second round, which is almost a third rounder. But I agree, probably still too early, right? For that. At the same time, though, the Buccaneers, and this is something you probably know because you know everything about football, but the Buccaneers are the only NFL team that has never signed a quarterback to his second contract that they've ever drafted. We're talking way back in the day from Doug Williams, right, to Vinny Testaverde, to Jameis Winston and Josh Freeman, and then all of the second-round picks, the Sean Kings, the third-round picks, the Chris Sims. This team has never, ever drafted a successful quarterback. All of the quarterbacks.
I mean, obviously, there was no reason for me to be thinking about that, so I certainly wouldn't have known that.
Right. Well, I mean, what I'm saying, though, is if you're looking for success in Tampa, right, you look at the division winners, you look at the Super Bowl champions, Brad Johnson, Jeff Garcia, Brian Greasy in 2005, Tom Brady, obviously, and now Baker Mayfield. It's all been free agents, right? But it's not going to keep this team from stopping to try to draft a quarterback. Jason Line's done it a couple times with Jameis Winston and Kyle Trask. So maybe try again. But having said that, you look around the league, the Packers are probably the envy of the entire NFL, going from Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, right? 3 quarterbacks in almost 4 decades.
Right.
But this might be the time where the Buccaneers look at this big crop of quarterbacks and take another stab at it.
Well, they're not going to take one early. So,
correct.
I mean, we know, rightly or wrongly, because quarterbacks get drafted, rightly or wrongly, 4 quarterbacks are going to go early.
Yeah.
Now, without getting into a debate about the particular quarterbacks, we know 4 quarterbacks are going to go early.
Yeah.
It's likely 2 more will go by the top 40. So
right.
I don't think the Bucs would be in the market for a quarterback in the top 40. Do you?
Right. No, not that early. It's
no.
Certainly.
So, I haven't done a lot of the later round quarterbacks just because I've got to get through, every position. So I haven't done, the some of the guys that are later round picks.
Yeah.
And plus, when you do get to a later round pick, obviously a guy is a later round pick for a reason. Doesn't mean he can't play. Right. I mean, look, hey, there are people who through the years said, well, why do you even draft a quarterback number 1? Tom Brady won Super Bowl. They say stupid stuff like that. But, with a later round pick, there's a reason guys are later round picks. I mean, you showed Michael Pratt, Spencer Rattler. Those guys are going to get drafted. They might not get drafted till round 3. Who knows? You never know how that plays out in a draft. And they could end up being really good players. I mean, Spencer Rattler was the number 1 quarterback recruited in the country coming out of Arizona. And when he went to Oklahoma, he's a very gifted thrower. Michael Pratt's been a 3 or 4 year starter, very consistent player, not necessarily a high level traits guy, but we've seen a lot of quarterbacks in this league, play at a nice level who don't necessarily have the highest level traits. There's reasons why guys play well and reasons why they don't. And it's not always because they have a big arm. That's there's so many reasons and so many variables. So, maybe Spencer Rattler becomes a great starting quarterback in this league. So you never know. And maybe if he's sitting there and they really like him, and again, the 3 of us don't know that because the Bucs aren't going to tell you what they think. No team does. But, maybe if he's sitting there in the 3rd round, they say, you know what? We have this kid as a low 2nd round pick. We're going to draft him. You never know how that goes.
That's right. Yeah. And one of these days they'll hit on a quarterback.
Have to.
This is my 30th,
at some point.
This is my 30th year covering the team, right? And I've yet to see this team draft a quarterback that can really take them to the playoffs and beyond. We'll see if that eventually happens.
Hey, well, you know what? You've won a couple of Super Bowls, Scott, so you can't really complain. There's a lot of teams that haven't.
Exactly, yeah, and got to cover Tom Brady too, which
I mean, God, how many Super Bowls have they won while you've been there?
2, both of them. That's it. Yeah. And at least they're 2-0.
2-0, yeah, undefeated.
The Falcons are 0-2.
They make it. So, just got to make it, and they're fine.
Yeah. So just to get you out of here, Greg, we really appreciate your time. Speaking of other quarterbacks and the Falcons, what are your thoughts on Kirk Cousins going to Atlanta? And of course, we saw this last year, and it pisses off Buccaneer fans because, granted, Tom Brady retired, and I understand the national media landscape when it comes to anointing the Saints last year when Derek Carr arrived, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't give Baker Mayfield a chance due to the recency bias that happened in 2022. But now all of a sudden, the Buccaneers have won this division 3 years in a row, and they re-signed a lot of the key components that got them the championship last year. And now all of a sudden, the Atlanta Falcons, due to Kirk Cousins, just like Derek Carr's arrival made the Saints the favorites last year, now the Falcons are have already been crowned. What are your thoughts on Atlanta?
Well, let me just ask you this: who's playing outside corner for the Bucs if they had to play tomorrow?
Outside cornerback, Zion
McCollum and Jamel
Dean.
Okay. I think Kirk Cousins, and again, only one team wins the Super Bowl, and we know Mahomes has won a bunch. Okay. Kirk Cousins has been a very, very good quarterback in this league. I'm not a numbers guy, but I mean, if you look at numbers, he does the same thing every year.
Yeah.
He throws 30 plus touchdowns, doesn't throw a lot of picks, seemingly has those 1 or 2 games a year that are not great. And that's what people focus on.
Right.
Obviously has not had playoff success, and that's what people focus on. Those questions are impossible to answer. If you just want to look at playoff success, that's fine. There's a lot of teams that would be very happy to line up with Kirk Cousins at quarterback.
Yeah.
I mean, he really knows how to play the position at a high level.
Yeah.
He's a smart guy. He throws the ball well. He understands his offense. He's just a really solid, good NFL quarterback.
Yeah.
Falcons will be, they'll be an interesting team this year. Now, obviously, they have a change with Raheem Morris, so the defense will be different.
Yeah.
But first of all, it'll be interesting because Liam Coen and Raheem Morris are probably buddies, and they know each other really well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Well, it's going to be interesting to see. One last question for you. How would you define Baker Mayfield? We'll kind of bring it full circle here and talking about these quarterbacks. Mike Evans said he wanted to play with an elite quarterback, right? And of course, that's his guy, so he's going to prop up his guy. But we saw a perfect game from Baker Mayfield at Lambeau Field of all places, right? And then he carved up the Eagles big time in the playoffs, right? And then had some shortcomings. Had a couple games where he's below 50% completion against the Falcons in Atlanta, against the Carolina Panthers. Part of that was in a rainstorm, but in back-to-back weeks. So
yeah, and I'm not one who uses the word consistency because it's another one of those words, but how would I define him? I mean, we started this with the idea that there's not a lot of mystery as to what he is.
Mm-hmm.
If he's protected, and we talked about the interior of the O-line, and the run game can be better. It doesn't have to be the best in the league, but it's a factor. Then I think Baker can function at a reasonably high level. Now, again, we're not going to talk about Baker Mayfield the same way we talk about Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow or Josh Allen. But Baker, and I don't want fans to think I'm making, again, a direct comparison because I'm not. But I think Baker can play stylistically more like a Joe Burrow. Like that would be his style of play.
Yeah.
Where he works from the pocket at a pretty high level. Burrow has better movement, but Baker would have enough movement that he's not a statue. But there's other factors that have to be in play for Baker to do that every single week. Yeah. And if those factors are not in play, like if the defense were to be bad, if the run game was non-existent again, there's many factors that would make it difficult for Baker.
You can't carry a team, but
the word elite is another one of those words,
right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, who's elite? You are, Greg. We really appreciate your breakdowns.
I concur.
Your film.
See, people don't like when not you guys, but because I don't do lists and I certainly don't do mock drafts, but I'm not a list guy because to me, it's because I know, have great conversations with a lot of coaches, talk a lot of ball. To me, there's so many variables. This stuff is not a mathematical equation.
Right.
It's not 2 and 2, it's 4. And people want 2 and 2 to be 4 all the time. And it's just not. And I don't see the game that way. I see the game, I love the process. And the process has so many variables.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, there's different offenses, different talents, players that the quarterbacks are playing with.
Yeah, there's many things. It's like with the quarterbacks every year, and then we'll wrap up, in this draft. I mean, everybody's, how do you rank them? How do you do? Well, I don't really rank them. I can talk about what I believe their traits are and how I think they should be deployed best within the context of an offense. But, it's hard for me to rank. I mean, there's some obvious ones. Like obviously, Caleb Williams is a better prospect than Michael Pratt, but that's easy.
Yeah.
But I mean,
right.
I can't just rank them. That's hard for me to do.
Yeah, because there's scheme fit and coaching styles and supporting cast, all that stuff. Right?
Yeah, there's coaching. I mean, Clyde Christensen, who I'm sure because he was in Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
He coached Drake May this year at North Carolina. He was at North Carolina for that purpose. So you have to believe that Drake May has a pretty good sense of a lot of NFL schemes and just the NFL thought process, what it takes to be a quarterback in the NFL.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Well, when it comes to the NFL and breaking down film, nobody does it better than Greg Cosell. Greg, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining the Pewter Report podcast.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. Really enjoyed it, guys. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, that's some great stuff on Baker Mayfield and the Buccaneers and some draft prospects from one of our all-time guests. We love when Greg Cosell comes on. We'll try to have him on again after the draft, maybe break down some of these Buccaneer draft picks and kind of set the stage and the plate for 2024 and the upcoming season. Matt, that was outstanding. Almost as outstanding as the flavors that you're going to get when you drink Celsius. Am I right, my friend?
Very, very fantastic segue. Yes. Doesn't get much better than Celsius energy drinks, the official energy drink of PewterReport.com. Check out the Celsius Essentials, their newest line of Celsius energy drinks. These are the tall boy of Celsius. They got 270 milligrams of caffeine, so a little extra oomph when you're having a Celsius. Great flavors like the Blue Crush and the Dragonberry. Don't forget about the OG flavors like the Strawberry Lemonade or the Arctic Vibe. So if you need to know where to find a Celsius energy drink, go to the store locator on their website, punch in your address, and it'll tell you where to find one. Could be at a local Walmart, Target, 7-Eleven, health and fitness store, or maybe if you're in Queens, like where Greg Cosell grew up, you could find one at your bodega. And once you keep going to your bodega, you love Celsius, you want to get it in bulk. You can buy it in bulk. I'd recommend getting that variety pack because variety is the spice of life. And there's awesome flavors of Celsius. Go to Amazon, click on the subscribe and save, and you can have it sent to your place of residence whenever you want. You're in charge. Just make sure you're drinking Celsius energy drinks, the official energy drink of PewterReport.com. Great conversation with Greg Cosell. I already feel smarter just talking to him about the game of football. But we have more Bucs news, Scott, because obviously this news broke yesterday while we were on the Pewter Report podcast. Had a little more time to digest it. And obviously we spoke to Randy Gregory today as well, the newest signing of the Bucs. Obviously he plays outside linebacker, was on the Broncos and the 49ers last season. I gave my opinion on the show yesterday. So, Scott, just your initial thoughts about this new signing by the Bucs.
I think this is not going to preclude the Buccaneers from drafting an outside linebacker. If the right guy is there in the right round, I think that they'll take him. But this does not mean they have to. And I think this is really key because I have been told, and I'm told every year, but I'm reminded by certain members, plural, of the Bucs brass, you can't fill every need in the draft. Can't do it, right? Yep. It just doesn't align that way, right? Sometimes if you take an interior offensive lineman here, you miss out on the wide receiver there. If you grab the wide receiver here, you miss out on the edge rusher there, right? And you can look at this team and real quick, right? They need another wide receiver. Chris Godwin is in the last year of his contract. Mike Evans will be 31 this year, 2 years left in his deal. Trey Palmer is not yet ascended to being a starting caliber receiver, so you can make that conclusion there. They certainly need, as Greg mentioned, another offensive lineman, certainly a left guard, probably an upgrade at center. There's 3 spots we're talking about. They could use another inside linebacker, certainly on the depth chart to replenish the depth they lost from Devin White, if not find a starter there to challenge KJ Britt. They could use more running backs, right? Chase Edmonds re-signed for 1 year. Yeah. And then next year, Rashad White will be in his contract year. You don't pay running backs.
Crazy to think.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Then you throw in outside linebacker. Then you throw in defensive backfield depth. So what this does is if you look at the depth chart, I have a story coming out about this tomorrow. I don't want to spoil it, but make sure you read that story on PewterReport.com. Just look at the depth chart. And this team does not have to draft an outside linebacker this year. They don't have to draft an edge rusher with the signing of Gregory. So I think it's kind of like You can ease into the draft, and if there's the right guy, the right
Yes.
rounds, you grab him. But you don't have to force the pick the way the way that they did, honestly, with Logan Hall, Matt, when they felt compelled to draft the defensive tackle early to replace Ndamukong Suh. They didn't get the right guy, and it forced Jason Light and Todd Bowles to have to draft Kalijah Kancey, same spot at the top of the draft the next year.
It puts the Bucs in a nice situation where when it comes to if they want to draft an outside linebacker, it would be because he's the best player on their board or the best player available, which is nice. And we don't even know if Randy Gregory is going to start. He didn't know that either. He said he's not expecting to be the starter. And it was very cool to see him say that, like, he obviously doesn't know anyone on the Bucs really, except for George Edwards, who was one of his coaches when he was with the Cowboys. But he actually talked about remembering meeting Todd Bowles when he was coming out of Nebraska
2015.
During the whole draft process. And that, for whatever reason, kind of stuck with him. And then he said, I can play in this defense, whether it's 3-4, 4-3, line up outside, inside, put my hand in the dirt, drop back in coverage, and things like that. And the connection with George Edwards, I mean, they only worked together for 2 seasons in 2020 and 2021. But that 2021 season was one of the best seasons of his career. He tied his career best with 6 sacks, also had an interception, which is a nice little caveat for a guy that might be dropping back in coverage occasionally. And he had a career best 3 forced fumbles. Now, is that all because George Edwards? No, but it is nice to have a familiar face when you did the best of your career. So it'll be interesting how it plays out if they don't draft an outside linebacker. Competition for who's going to start, I think, will be interesting, but we'll see a lot of a rotation anyway. So it certainly helps the depth if something happens to Yaya, JTS, or Anthony Nelson. Now you got Gregory in there. And I almost think it's better if he's in on a rotation because he's a guy, with the exception of last season, has not really gone through a full season. Now, he's had a lot of suspensions that derailed it, but a bit injury prone as well. So I think a rotation for him is probably the best way to go about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm fine with him being a rotational player. And when you look at the fact that he is 31, I think if you rotate him with Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, Anthony Nelson, and the other thing too is this team added 3 outside linebackers to the mix last year, right?
Correct.
You have Yaya Diaby, you've got Marquise Watts, who they really like, and then you also have Jose Ramirez, friend of the program, who they also like.
Yes.
And if you keep drafting guys, you're not giving the guys you already have on the roster a chance to to show that they can play. Now, you don't want to put all your eggs in an undrafted free agent and a 6th-round draft picks basket. I get that. And Diaby's a 3rd rounder. He's a day 2 guy. But these guys get paid for a living. Todd Bowles, Jason Light, they know what a good pass rusher looks like. And more importantly, so does Tristan Wirfs and Luke Gedeke. And Matt, how many times do we hear from them? How many times there were, Marquise Watts was giving them fits. Jose Ramirez was giving them fits. So I'm not saying that this team doesn't need better outside linebacker play or don't draft a guy, but they might have a gem on their team here, and Denver had a gem in Shaq Barrett that they didn't even really fully realize, right? They drafted Bradley Chubb, paired him with Von Miller, but yet neither Von Miller nor Bradley Chubb had a 19.5 sack season. Shaq Barrett did here in Tampa. He made the Pro Bowl twice and won a Super Bowl. So just saying, that there's that. Speaking of defense, let's get to some other news real quick before we get out of here. The Buccaneers have had a couple of top 30 additions, top 30 visit guys, and they're all on the defensive side, which makes me happy. Jeremiah Trotter Jr., the son of Jeremiah Trotter, the Eagles linebacker, coming in for a top 30 visit, along with Kool-Aid McKinstry, Alabama defensive back, the cornerback, who is probably going to be a 1st-round pick, and then also Byron Murphy, who I love, a big-time havoc wrecker in the middle of the defensive tackle out of Texas. So those are the 3 latest three latest top 30 visit guys to Tampa Bay. I'm going to drop that link in the chat. You can read about all of the players that have visited the Bucs so far or set to visit for top 30 visits, and you can check that out.
Yes, you can. By the way, we got a super chat. Thank you to Paul, a.k.a. Florida Dream House, who says, thanks for the $5 super chat. Just saying thanks for delivering the goods consistently with Pewter Report. Great guests, conversation, and fun. Go Bucs. Off season is flying by quickly. Paul, we always appreciate the super chats, and we thank you for the very, very kind words. You mentioned guests. We have more guests coming. I know we were supposed to have on Greg Allman. Don't you worry. We're still getting Greg on the show. He's going to be on the show on next Tuesday.
Correct.
We will talk about the NFC South, whether the Bucs still rule it or not. So that'll be next Tuesday's show. We'll still have a show on Monday, but guest-wise, have Greg Allman coming up on Tuesday. And Thursday is going to be an awesome day because not only do we get to speak to Jason Light earlier in the day, but then we have a Pewter Report alumni, one of our favorite people really in the world, let alone media. Trevor Sikkema, former Pewter Report, will be with us on Thursday's show. So a lot of great guests coming up.
Yep. And I've been talking to a couple Buccaneer players about coming on, and it's still vacation time for them, but I have had some replies and just working out some times and dates. We'd love to keep the show at 4:00 if they can make it. But if we have to do a primetime podcast to accommodate their schedule, we'll see if we can do that as well. Marlon, appreciate that $1.99 super chat. We appreciate all the super chats.
Yes.
And here's your question.
He says, how soon we forget Baker was almost benched? There was a time where Baker's play was slipping a little bit during that losing streak. But then again, like that game against the Texans, that wasn't Baker Mayfield's fault. But on the flip side, they got out of that losing streak. They won 2 games in a row, and Baker's completion percentage was in the 40s in those games.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit of peaks and valleys with Baker Mayfield. But I think the positive far outweighed the negative. But nonetheless, we appreciate the comment for sure. And the Bucs clearly thought so too, because they signed him to that big deal.
Yep, exactly. We want you to sign up for Pewter Report TV by hitting the subscribe button. It's super easy. It's also free. It says subscribe, but all you're doing is hitting the button. Help us get to 14,000 by the end of the draft. That's what our goal is. By the end of this month, we want to be at 14,000. That's the Chris Godwin number. We're inching closer to 13,600. So if you're watching this podcast or listening to it, just join the crew. Just hit that button and help us get to 13,600, and then we'll be at 13,700, and before you know it, we'll be at 14,000. That's our goal this offseason. So help us get there. We appreciate all the Pewter people for doing that.
Yeah, please do so. You can follow us on all of our social media on X, Facebook, and Instagram at Pewter Report, and our YouTube channel is Pewter Report TV, where we have the podcast, various clips, and a lot of great content on the website. So, and YouTube channel. That is going to do it for us on today's show. A great week of podcasts. We're going to try to do it even better next week with more guests. So until then, for Scott Reynolds, I'm Matt Matera saying thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next week for another edition of the Pewter Report podcast. Have a great weekend. Congrats to Trista Wirfs on the birth of his son.
Yeah, absolutely. Congrats, Wirfs.
Peace out.